Hi, everybody, and welcome to this latest edition of the Analysts with Jake Novak. I'm your host, Jake Novak. And we had something happen in just the last several days that I think was tailor-made for this show. Remember, the Analyst is the program where we take a look at campaign strategies, campaign messaging, or the lack thereof, and talk about it, whether it's working, whether it's not working, what a smarter person would do if they're doing something that isn't smart. And there was something like that came down the pike over the last several days that I really wanted to dedicate an entire segment to, and the first segment of this edition of The Analyst to. And that is this very interesting proposal from former President Donald Trump, and of course, Republican nominee for President Donald Trump, to eliminate the federal taxes, the income taxes on tip income. Now, some of you may not know that when you tip your waiter or tip a bellhop or tip anyone really in a service industry, that's fully taxable. The person who gets that tip has to keep track of it, has to pay the taxes on it as if it's regular income. And there's a lot of people at the IRS who are dedicated to cracking down on that once in a while. It's definitely a big part of what the IRS does. So this will be a big move, and the policy, I think, can be debated and discussed for a long time. And I do that on some of my other platforms and some of my other writing, and I'll be happy to talk about it. And of course, if you follow me on Twitter X at JakeNY, you'll see a lot of stuff I've already written about it. But that's not the point I want to talk about today, because for this program, what's really important to understand is this is an interesting campaign strategy. Now, folks, first of all, let's realize how long it's been since we've discussed a particular policy and debated it one way or the other in this particular presidential election. This presidential election has been about Trump's court cases. It's been about discussing Joe Biden's mental condition. It's been about discussing the past records, not necessarily policies, but past statements and records and the financial situations for both of these candidates. I can't remember the last time when we discussed an actual policy and decided whether it would be good or bad. So we got that with this tip income flotation. Now, again, every campaign has that list of policy proposals. No one ever reads them, right? But they all have them. So it's not like the campaigns don't have policy proposals. It's just been, it feels like it's been a really long time since someone has said, this is going to be my policy, and get specific on a strategy and on a specific way to do it. In other words, I'm not saying the presidential campaign hasn't been talking about issues. You'll hear Donald Trump talking about the border. You'll hear Joe Biden talking about student loans or things like inflation. Again, I'm not talking about whether or not they're being effective in handling it. They'll talk about the issues, but rarely will they get specific on the policy. When Donald Trump says Joe Biden has made a disaster at the border, we're not hearing him say exactly what he would go back to or what he would implement. He talks about it in generalities. And I'm not criticizing that. I'm just making a point that we don't really hear about specific policy. This is not just a specific policy, but it's a very simple one to understand. Now, if you get tip income, you have to pay federal income taxes on it. And Donald Trump is promising that if elected, you won't. After he's elected, that would be something he would implement very, very quickly. Let's listen to Donald Trump. This was just a few days ago, not a really long time ago, where he first unveiled this policy. He did it in Las Vegas, and I'll talk about why that's important. Let's listen to him unveil this policy for the very first time.
This is the first time I've said this, and for those hotel workers and people that get tips, you're going to be very happy, because when I get to office, we are going to not charge taxes on tips, people making tips. We're not going to do it, and we're going to do that right away, first thing in office, because it's been a point of contention for years and years and years, and you do a great job of service, you take care of people, and I think it's going to be something that really is deserved. More importantly, popular or unpopular. I do some unpopular things, too, if it's right for the country. I do what's right. But so those people that have jobs in restaurants, whatever the job may be, a tipping job, we're not going after for taxes anymore. This will be ended.
Okay, so that was in Las Vegas about 6 days before something else happened where Donald Trump said something else that was going on just a few days after he first announced the policy. And this is something that he's attributing. I don't know if he's the first person to have done it, but this is something that Donald Trump is attributing to an actual celebrity. Let's listen to what he said just a few days later.
In fact, on your receipt, when you get your receipt for a restaurant, you know who sent me one? Kid Rock. How good is Kid Rock? Isn't he great? But he sent me a receipt. And he wrote on the receipt, vote for Trump and you won't pay taxes on tips. He wrote that on the receipt. I said, that's very smart. That's very smart. Smart guy.
Okay, so there you have it. You have President Trump announcing 6 days before he talks about it again that he's promising to implement this policy. And again, he did that in Nevada. And Nevada is a state where you can understand getting rid of taxes on tip income would be a very big deal. You've got a lot of waitresses and waiters in Nevada. You've got a lot of hotel workers. That's the key constituency in that state. There's also a little bit of a real estate empire in there that has its ups and downs, believe me. And I think they're sort of on an up right now, maybe not at the highest level. But for the most part, you do something to help the service industry in Nevada, and that sounds, that'll work pretty well. But then you had this whole thing from Kid Rock, who was telling people, do what he did. And you can see, we'll show you a still picture of what Kid Rock wrote on his restaurant check, circling the tip and saying, if you vote Trump, you won't have to pay taxes on this anymore. Now, why is this all so unusual? Again, you've heard people say they're going to cut a tax before, or in the case of Joe Biden, talking about getting rid of student loan debt. It's not like we haven't heard about certain policies that would help a certain group that could help tip an election. But there's something very different about this that I hope everyone understands, and that is this has the potential to be a truly grassroots demonstration of one group's decision on how they're going to vote for president. Now, we've gotten through this incredible mirage the last several years, really, we're almost 20 years now, where we thought that posting things on social media is somehow grassroots, even if it's something that we totally came up with ourselves and not just reposting what a campaign put out or a professional marketing group put out. Even if you type something on your own, put it on social media and it gets a lot of likes, we seem to think that's like grassroots campaigning. It's not, because one of the things about grassroots campaigning and grassroots effective campaigns is it is in person. There is a person-to-person aspect of it. In other words, the original grassroots type campaigns were people knocking on doors, not official campaign members, just saying, hey, I'm your neighbor, really want the country to do better, I want you to vote for so-and-so. One of the best examples of that over the years was in the 1968 presidential election, when Eugene McCarthy was challenging Lyndon B. Johnson for the Democratic national nomination. And he had college kids walking in the neighborhoods where they were from, not going to someone else's neighborhood, but asked college kids when they were home for spring break to go around, or before that, maybe even in the winter break, to go around and knock on doors in their neighborhood and tell them they were going to vote for Eugene McCarthy and ask them if they would too. In fact, there was a little bit of a saying that went along with it called going clean for Gene, because he wanted all those college students that they had beards and long hair to cut their long hair and beards if they were going to go out and knock on the door so that they wouldn't frighten their neighbors. That didn't work so much, although Eugene McCarthy did have a big surge in the polls when that happened, and he almost did get the nomination when you think about it, coming from nowhere, just being an anti-Vietnam presidential candidate in the time. That was 1968. But it was pretty impressive as a grassroots method of getting people's attention. This could really be very interesting, because while it's person to person and it can only happen in an in-person situation, you got to be at that restaurant. You could maybe be getting takeout, but you'd have to see the face of the person that gives you that check, or at least be close enough to them that you can circle it and write your little message. And I guess there's a little bit of leeway. If you don't feel comfortable writing Donald Trump's name, you could just circle it and say, hey, one of the campaigns is looking to get rid of the taxes on this, and you should look into that. There's a lot of things you can do with a little pen and a circle on a restaurant check. But again, this is a grassroots idea, and I don't know if it's going to spread like wildfire across the country or not, but I wouldn't be surprised if it does. It's an easy thing to do, and if only one person per restaurant does it every day, that's going to seem like a lot of people doing it. Imagine if it's just one guy who goes into a one particular restaurant at a given day, but people will remember. There'll be people probably talking about it at that restaurant for a long time. The last time I even heard of something even remotely like this was the 1992 presidential election, when Ross Perot was running as an independent, if you remember that. And for a while in the polls, he was tied with Bush and Clinton. And one of the things that the Perot campaign did seemed like it was a grassroots maneuver or ploy And it seemed like it would be pretty interesting, but I kind of saw through it, and maybe you did too. I don't know if you remember, but in the summer of that presidential election, before we got to the nominating conventions, the Perot campaign put out messages to people saying, if you support Ross Perot during the day, keep your headlights on when you're driving outside. Now, you might think that's how would you know? Because these days, a lot of people drive with their headlights on 24/7, even on a bright sunny day, because insurance companies like you to do that. There's insurance companies that actually check to see if you have your daytime running lights, if you can get this a discount for it. We're used to that now. But in 1992, if you saw someone driving around with their headlights on during the day, that was a little unusual. But it was starting to happen in America. And it was a brilliant move by the Perot campaign to kind of seize on that, because anyone seeing it would assume, oh, that must be another Perot supporter, when probably half of them weren't. And they just had their lights on because, again, that was just starting to be a trend in driving practices in this country. But again, that aside, it was an interesting thing that people could do. It would have been a real grassroots thing, something that a person could do to personally signify that they're supporting a particular candidate, and doing that very publicly. And that's what this maneuver would be if people go for it, if the Donald Trump campaign is able to get a significant number, a critical mass of people to go ahead and do this. Now, the thing about grassroots campaigns and the thing about doing little ploys like this is that the candidate himself needs to stay on it. In other words, this can't be something that Donald Trump just mentions once in a while, or as one part of his very long rallies when he gives those long speeches at rallies. He's going to have to stay on this and work on more simplicity in his messaging. This is one of the pitfalls that Donald Trump and the Trump campaign, and also the Biden campaign, have. They both have this problem in that they have a laundry list of things they can list about the other candidate that a lot of voters will probably respond to. But less is more, especially when you're dealing with presidential elections. So I think this is one of those things that would make the cut of the 4 or 5 things that Donald Trump should really focus on. Because again, even if just one person per restaurant per day circles their check with this little message, it's going to seem like one of the biggest grassroots movements in the history of elections in this country, and it might actually really help him win the election. It's an interesting strategy. It's one of those things that this show was made for pointing out. I am not saying it's going to work yet, but I'm saying it is very, very different from what we've seen, and it does have the potential. It feels like a very low risk has very low risk potential to be an explosive tool for the Trump campaign. If I'm the Biden campaign, I wouldn't really know how to respond to that, because just responding to it will give more publicity to the fact that people can do this. It's, again, for many, many reasons, this could be a great tool. I don't know if I'd bet $100,000 yet on the Trump campaign absolutely exploiting it to the max and really doing the right thing with it. But they seem to be going in the right direction, so we'll see. Well, the other thing that's, of course, the big elephant in the room is that we still have this presidential debate on the schedule, Biden versus Trump, June 27th, and it's the main event in an election that people are really trying to see how people are going to perform in a live situation, an unscripted, unedited situation. So when we come back, the very great national radio host, Grace Curley, is going to join me. We're going to talk debate strategies, debate pitfalls. You're not going to want to miss it when the analyst comes back. Welcome back to The Analyst with Jake Novak, and we're getting close to that debate. Now, full disclosure, you've heard me say it not only on my next guest program, but on a few other media platforms. I've been predicting for quite a while that these debates are not going to happen between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. I'm running out of time for me to be right about that, but one of the things you'll know about me is that if I'm wrong, I will take full responsibility for it. There's a lot of people telling me I shouldn't give up yet. I won't. I'm going to give it until about 48 hours before the debate. Maybe I should give it until 4 minutes, but I'm going to try to be an adult about this if I'm wrong. But if you remember, I really thought that the Biden administration, the Biden campaign's eagerness to make a debate deal, even before the Trump trial ended, was all about the fact that they knew the conviction was coming, and they wanted to make it have the appearance of propriety, appearance of, oh, we wanted to do this debate, but the conviction and the sentencing come up. We have to stop. We can't do it now. I wonder if they're still going to try that. But anyway, let's assume that I will be wrong and the debate is going to happen. And that's why my next guest is so important to have on. I'm really, really honored to have Grace Curley from the national radio show, The Grace Curley Show. She works with Howie Carr up in Boston, the legendary Howie Carr. And of course, I guess he gets credit for discovering Grace. Grace has been incredibly graceful and gracious to have me as a guest 3 or 4 times, maybe even 5 times now on her program. And she's joining us now to talk about debate strategy and debate stuff like that. And I'm going to let Grace tell us in a little while about where you can watch or listen to her show anytime, no matter where you are. But I, by the way, just personally, I like logging into WRKO, that radio station, because it's an easy 3 call letters to remember. Anyone here listening over 50 knows WRKO, like RKO Pictures. So that's how I remember. And they have a really nice website. So first of all, Grace, thanks for joining us. And thanks for not laughing at me for looking like I was wrong about this debate prediction. You're very kind.
I am so honored to be asked to be on your show, Jake. This is blowing my mind that you actually wanted me as a guest. I'm used to hosting, which is so cool. And also, I don't think you should give up on your prediction at all, because when I've had you on my show, I have to say, you've been right about a lot of your predictions, not just with the Trump trial, but with the effects of the verdict and what that's going to do with the polling. I mean, your predictions, and I don't say this lightly, have been pretty on the mark. So I wouldn't give up, like you said, until 48 hours before.
Yeah, well, the good news is I know when to do most of my predictions. I don't go on the sports betting sites. I'm smart enough not to do that. I stick with stuff that I think I have a better shot at. But so thank you for that. Grace, obviously the elephant in the room is mental cognition. Now, the Biden campaign is trying, it's interesting. I don't know if you've noticed this. They have downgraded their chatter about Joe Biden. Remember, for about 2 years, it was all about how sharp he is, how you can't keep up with this guy. He's tough. He's really sharp. The last couple of weeks we've heard, well, sure, he's old and slow, but so's the other guy. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, they're lowering expectations tremendously. The word I remember them using at the beginning of his presidency was Socratic, that he carries around all of these leather-bound books like Ron Burgundy, and he reads a lot. And that was, Dr. Jill said, my biggest pet peeve with Joe is he keeps the reading light on late at night. We're supposed to have this idea that he's splitting the atom behind the scenes, which is just so ridiculous. We see what we see. But yeah, they're lowering the expectation so that if he comes out and he delivers a full sentence, then we're all going to be impressed. And you know this better than anyone, Jake. The media already has the headlines written. Joe Biden meets the moment, A+ performance. Even critics have to bow down to what a giant he is on the debate stage. We already know all that. So I think at this point, they're just banking on the fact that everyone's going to think he's going to, not be able to put a couple words together. And when he does, they're going to pretend that they're amazed by it.
Yeah, I wrote some of the questions for a few of the presidential election debates in 2016. And a lot of people said, what should the questions be? How will CNN, because they're hosting the debate, how are they going to weigh this in favor of Joe Biden? And there's a lot of easy answers to that question. One of the things that debate questioners do in presidential debates is they try to show how smart and researched they are. So for the first time, even though all they've covered for months, even if it's a right-wing news channel, is basically stuff about personality or the trial, suddenly they'll come up with some policy or some tax law that they've never talked about before and say, did you know about this? I mean, it's very pathetic. I have to say, and I'd love to hear what you think, if I were writing the questions for this debate, I am a huge fan of addressing elephants in the room. And the first question I would ask to both Joe Biden and Donald Trump is, gentlemen, listen, their polls go up and down, but one constant that we've seen from the American people over more than a year is that most Americans would really prefer somebody else besides the two of you running. Without blaming your opponent, can you tell us why you think that is and how you're about to address it? So that would be my first question, because I think that's the thing that most Americans are thinking. I'm not saying they're right. I think maybe they should love Joe Biden or love Donald Trump. Fine. But with that, there's a lot of other people who say the first question should be about that mental cognition. Where do you stand on that?
I wouldn't mind if that were the first question asked. I think that's a reasonable question. I also think maybe the first question could be on the economy, could be on the border. There's just so many disasters under Joe Biden. There's so much to choose from. But one thing that I do think would be wise for Donald Trump is going into it knowing, like you said, how they can soften questions, they can give, really fluffy questions to Joe Biden, and that's okay as long as you know that going in. Nobody gets that more than Trump. He's going to go in there, and what I always loved, Jake, which he was able to do in 2016, but in 2020 even more so, because he was really hardened at that point by the political world that he had been in, is that if they didn't ask a question that the American people deserve to hear, he would ask it. He would turn around. And I think he needs to try to do that this time around in a little bit of a calmer way and a little bit of a more restrained way. But I did love the fire of Trump looking at Joe Biden and saying, you said you were going to do this, explain it to the American people, because these moderators are useless. They're not going to ask the important questions. So I think if you're Trump, and this would be advice for Biden too, is what is something that you want to ask? Because that's your time to ask it and have the other person explain.
So I'm going to take the ball you just pitched and run with it a little bit. I know I just mixed two sports metaphors there, but the greatest debates in American history, they are not misnamed, were the great debates between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. If you have a chance, everyone watching, if you have a chance to read some of the transcripts of them, obviously they didn't have tape recorders back then, but they're not that badly transcribed considering it was 160 years ago, 100 more than that, 100 almost 170 years ago. They didn't have any moderators. There was no moderator. And by the way, they all went on for like hours. I think they were like 3-4 hours each. There were 7 of them in the course of like 2 weeks. It was crazy. And not only did the two candidates basically talk about issues the whole time, there were no personal attacks in any of them. That's also very interesting. But they basically talked policy. They talked, and clearly the policy was how you were going to deal with slavery. But there were other issues as well. People who know their history know that Lincoln was also really close, and a close second to slavery was his desire to have the Transcontinental Railroad built, and he really got a lot of that done even during the war. But what's really interesting about that, Grace, is that once the war started, because of those debates, one of the first people to rush to the support of Abraham Lincoln, even though he would have been welcomed in the Confederacy, one of the first people to tell Abraham Lincoln he needed to raise a bigger army to crush the Confederacy was Stephen Douglas. He rushed to the White House, went to his old opponent and say, oh, this 40,000 man army you got? Yeah, try 200,000, dude. You need to go get these guys. My point is, if I were Donald Trump or Joe Biden, I don't really expect either one of them to do this, but Trump, of course, a much better chance. The first thing you should say is, we don't need these moderators. Joe, this just the two of us have a talk here. I'll you want to cut my mic off after a minute? Great. Same rules for you. I think that'd be a great way to undermine the moderators right away, because once they try to get more involved in it, it'll look more like a desperate measure, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And, you do wish that they could, but something that you just said, so I'm going to take the ball and I'm going to hit it or run with it or whatever the expression would be. I think that the idea of not going personal is really interesting because it's so tempting with Joe Biden to go on the attack. And I want to clarify here because I get a lot of grief on my show about a lot of different things, but specifically here about asking Trump, because people hate this word presidential, especially big Trump supporters. They think it means that I'm, getting soft or like I'm wishy-washy on Trump. That's not how I mean it. I just mean for 2 hours, it's possible to stay presidential. It's possible to stay above board. And I don't say it from a moral high ground. I say it from the perspective of they could swap Joe Biden out at any moment. And if you make everything about Joe Biden and how old he is and how he can't put a sentence together, and then they stick Gavin Newsom in, guess what? You didn't spend that time making your case about your agenda to the American people. And something I noticed was recently Trump was on with Sean Hannity and they asked him about Hunter. And I think that most people would expect him at that point to go low, to take a dig. I mean, he's earned it at this point with the disinformation, the Russian laptop, all that stuff. But instead, he said, listen, my uncle has struggled with addiction. I understand. He really took a classier approach than I think. And I think there's something to be said for if you do try that with Joe Biden, it might throw him off. They're expecting Trump to come out and be mean and, not hold anything back. But if he does that when it comes to policy and not when it comes to personal attacks, I do think that it will kind of take a lot of air out of the Democrats' tires.
Well, it would absolutely flummox them because he's never been able to really not take the bait before. He's very pugnacious. And that, I think, yeah, that would surprise them. Last question I'll ask you is about the situation with the Biden campaign. Again, it's one of these things where we're kind of playing fantasy games, but if you're working for the Biden campaign, where do we go? I mean, I think the first thing I would say is clearly they think that angry and yelling Joe Biden is better than quiet Joe Biden, because at least that he seems to be more coherent, whether you like what he's saying or not, when he's yelling and angry. But again, how are they gonna get that going? I mean, is there something that you would say to Joe Biden that might be a smart? You just gave Donald Trump, I think, a pretty good piece of strategy. Is there something you could give Joe Biden on those lines? It's a tough one, I know.
It's tough. You know what I would say to Joe Biden, and it's something, Jake, that I'm curious if this will resonate with you from doing television hits occasionally and doing radio, is sometimes you just have to go with the simplest response. Sometimes you just have to not lose the plot. I do this all the time where someone's asking me a question, and while they're asking me a question, I'm thinking, I'm going to go here and I'm going to hit this point and I'm going to hit that point and I'm going to bring up Hunter Biden and I'm going to bring up this. And then something comes out of my mouth and it's like, that didn't really make any sense. You were trying to accomplish too much in a 15-second bite, where it's like, if Joe Biden can come up with the most basic response and get it out there in a way that makes sense and avoid doing that thing where he starts one train of thought and then says, well, I won't go into that. Or it starts another one and says, well, I shouldn't really talk about that. Whatever you're going to say, keep it simple, keep it short. Brevity is the soul of wit, and all those other things. So it's like, you got to keep it succinct, because otherwise he's like a train. He just goes way off the rails.
Yeah. I guess it isn't the last question, because I was thinking a little bit about the moderators again, and where, if you had a chance to ask a question, what would you ask of Donald Trump? Because I think that we know the Joe Biden questions. Why did you have this open border policy? You told us you were going to do it. And how can you say it's Donald Trump's fault that the border is open, that kind of thing. But if you could ask Donald Trump a question that you think would really distinctly help him or hurt him or just help clarify things, how would you do it? I mean, imagine you're the news director at CNN and you want questions that are going to trip Trump up. What would you think of? Because again, I think that's probably what they're burning the midnight oil for over at Hudson Yards right now, trying to figure out, how do I get that question that's going to get Donald Trump?
I think that I have two categories. I'm not going to pretend that I have the perfect question, the perfect phrasing. But if there's two categories that I think Trump is weak on, it would be, and they kind of tie in together, COVID and the handling of COVID. I thought that was Ron DeSantis's strongest pitch when he was running for president, and it wasn't a great campaign, so that's not really saying much. But his strongest pitch was, hey, I was tough on COVID when it was happening, or I was tough on the shutdowns when they were happening, and you were. And he never really gave a good explanation of that besides blaming other people. And the second thing, which also ties into it a little bit, is I was never impressed with his ability to read people and his ability to choose good people. There were some, Jake, some people in his, Kayleigh McEnany is a great example. I see her on Fox and I think, wow, she is really smart. She's not just, she's beautiful and she can talk. A lot of people can, but she's really smart. But those picks were few and far in between. There were a lot of people, Christopher Wray, there were a lot of people that Dr. Fauci, I know it wasn't his pick, but it was someone who he kind of gave him a lot of leeway. And one that's really fresh in my mind that makes me question his ability to distinguish between credible people and people without integrity is Michael Cohen. I mean, you watch that trial, you and I have talked about it at length. This was someone who was in his orbit for a very long time, and he's a sleazebag and he's a user. And the fact that only hit Donald Trump when it was much too late concerns me. And so as a voter, I don't know how CNN would phrase it. I don't know the gotcha way, but as a voter, I'm genuinely curious. How do we know that you're learning from these mistakes? He is an older guy. It's hard to teach old people. I don't mean this condescendingly, but it's the old expression, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. How do we know that that's something that you recognize you've made mistakes? He's admitted, Christopher Wray, he's admitted some of these people were mistakes. How can we be sure that you're going to at least honestly try to improve that and not make the same mistakes? Because I don't know. I sometimes wonder that. I'll give you an example. When Nikki Haley threw her support behind Donald Trump recently, and people were asking, why would you do this? Why would you do this? I was on with Howie and I said, she's angling to get a position probably in the White House. And Howie said, oh my gosh, no. Trump would never. They went head to head. And then the next day I see an article that Trump is saying, oh, there's going to be a place for Nikki Haley. That concerns me. I'm all for forgiveness. I'm all for letting things go after the campaign dies down. I get that. Think of all the great people that he's let back into his orbit, or maybe you should say they've let him back into their orbit. Ted Cruz, a lot of people, Marco Rubio, that he at one point was, really clashing with. I understand that part of it. But if you fundamentally disagree with someone, or if someone is a swamp creature through and through, you have to be able to recognize that and not make the same mistakes over and over again. That was a long answer, but that's
that's a great answer. And I would urge everyone, if you're not really understanding the weight of what Grace just talked about, I would urge everyone. It's a very long book, but it's one of the most important books written in America over the last 20 years, and that's the book about Ulysses Grant by Ron Chernow. And if you want to know about a great American, a hero who really lost, not only did he lose his reputation at the end of his life while he was still alive, but for basically 100 years after he died, his reputation remained in the gutter because of bad people who he allowed to get into his orbit and into the cabinet, who really absolutely took advantage of his presidency, almost destroyed his reputation. I mean, they really did destroy it. Ron Chernow's book has really helped to start to resurrect it. And I couldn't stop thinking about Donald Trump when I was reading it. I read it during his first term, or when he was about to take the office. And that's really important. Grace, tell everybody how they can watch you every day. I really think everyone should do that. It's such a great program, even when I'm not on it. And it's just good. It's good stuff.
Well, you're a huge part of the program. We love having you on, Jake, and my listeners have been so delighted to have you as a resource. Everyone can tune in we're on Rumble. That's a really popular way. If you want to watch it, get the visual, it's really fun to be part of the crew. So go to rumble.com and type in Howie Carr Radio Network, and then you'll see the Grace Curley Show. It's also, as you pointed out, on RKO. We put up the podcast every single day by 3:00, so you can listen to them there. And you can follow me on Twitter at @G_Curley. And thank you for having me on. I wish it was longer. This is so much fun.
Oh, my pleasure. And this is a really important way of understanding what's going on in the country. There's obviously Grace has a national show, but she comments a lot about stuff that's going on in Boston. Choose 10, 15 cities in America where you can just get the pulse every single day. Boston's one of them. Chicago, I think, is one of them. LA, there's a few other. Detroit. I mean, just by checking, and Houston. I mean, I could name a couple more, but that's what you need to do if you want to be on top of things and get it from sources like the Grace Curley Show. Grace, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see if I was right about this debate prediction, but I will be happy to come on and admit I was wrong if I am wrong, and then hopefully that will, at least people will say I had integrity.
Thank you, Jake. I appreciate it.
All right, bye, Grace. Listen, when we come back, I'm going to be joined by Noam Neusner, and Noam and I are going to talk about something very, very interesting. Could a foreign war that the United States isn't even fighting really tip this election or make a big effect on this election? I don't think we've ever seen that, ever. The last war that really tipped an American election was the Vietnam War, and sadly, we were fighting that one. So join us for that, and we'll give you an idea about what war it is. By the way, it's not Ukraine. Spoiler alert. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Analysts with Jake Novak. Now, started this new edition, this latest edition of The Analysts, talking about something that I haven't seen in a really, really long time in America, a potential actual person-to-person grassroots strategy in this election, with the people potentially writing on their restaurant checks that if you vote for Trump, this tip won't be taxed. Again, I don't know if this is going to work or not, but if it does, it'll be the first real, not social media, because social media is not grassroots, people. It isn't. Even when you write your own text or your own post, it's not really grassroots. The real definition is person-to-person contact. So that could actually be a real history-making event. There's another history-making event that I'm really, really surprised by, even though this is something that, of course, consumes a lot of my time and my interest, and that is the Israel-Hamas war, and how it really does seem that perhaps maybe not just the inner workings of the war, but how it's playing out here in the United States could really be potentially a major factor in this election. I can't remember a time when a war America wasn't actually fighting played any role in an election one way or the other. But it seems there are some people making this argument, and I want to flesh that out a little bit with someone who would really, I think, have a lot to say about it. Our guest is Noam Neusner. Now, Noam is a partner at 30 Point Strategies, who's also a speechwriter for the George H.W. Bush White House, does a lot of communications and content stuff. He is very well versed in all the kind of stuff that we talk about here in The Analyst. And side note, and I think this is proof of the, just to be positive, there's good things out there. Now, this is a little bit of a trivia thing. Noam's father and my father were basically colleagues for a long time. They never actually worked in the same place, but they were scholars, and basically they had very, very similar messages. But as anyone knows anything about academics, sometimes they had some testy debates. Noam Neusner and I only know each other from social media, and we've never had a testy debate. So who says social media is making peace, folks? That's all I can say. Noam lost his father, Rabbi Jacob Neusner, a few years ago. He has a million books to read. I urge you to go on Google or Bing and look for some of those books. I'm happy to say my father's still around, but he talks very, very admirably about your father's work all the time. But no, it's the two of us now, the idiot second generation.
The next generation. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
We're hopefully not idiots. And so again, this is my question to you right off the bat. Do you think that the way that Americans are responding to the Israel-Hamas war could be a tipping point in this election, or if it's not a tipping point, a major factor in the polls?
Well, it certainly could be. I mean, listen, it's a very major issue for a fraction of Americans. Obviously, people who are very pro-Israel, such as myself, view it as either a singular or a top three issue for who they're going to support: presidential election, senatorial elections, and to a lesser extent, congressional and local races. The reason for that is because what the other side is also doing. The other side, what I would call the Hamas coalition, people who not only are generally hostile to the presence of a Jewish state on the planet, they're particularly hostile to America's longtime support for Israel. And they have found in Hamas, for some very strange and interesting reasons, a cause that they actually are drawn to. Now, that I think is one of the reasons why that cause is largely anti-Semitic, if not exclusively anti-Semitic. But importantly, they have the progressive Hamas coalition has built a political identity in the last 7 months around support for Hamas's murders of Jews. And it's put it bluntly like that because I think it has to be viewed that way. There's no other way to charitably even view it. And because their political identity, the political action, the way that they view political action as having only one purpose, which is to, essentially protest America's ongoing support for Israel, such as it is, we have to take it very seriously that they might well vote their conscience in November.
I think it's important for this discussion because you helped bring me to the direction that I wanted to go, which is that I don't think Americans will vote one way or the other based on the way that Israel or Hamas is fighting that war all the way over in the Middle East. I think it's going to be about how people are responding to it here in the United States.
Oh, yeah.
I think that there's a good argument to be made that all the videos of all the campus protests, all the videos of the disruptions on the Brooklyn Bridge or in the streets here and there are having a much bigger impact on the voters than what they may be seeing overseas, because this is something that again, you may not care about the Middle East or anything else like that, but maybe you're sending your kids to a college and you don't know whether there's going to be enough peace on campus for him or her to get to class.
Yeah.
I think, again, to me, it's the polls tell the same story all the time, no matter where they're going in general. It says every time that Joe Biden's weakness is not with the far left, not with the pro-Hamas crowd that you just described. His weakness is with these moderates, with the middle of the road folks. I would say maybe the John Fetterman types. If I were advising him, I would say get double, triple down on your support for Israel. Don't play this game, because that's going to help you more in the polls. Doesn't seem to be doing that. But do you think there's something that he could be doing to address the protesters on campus in a stronger way that might actually help him get out of that problem here?
Well, for sure. For sure that he could be doing things that I would call essential statesman-like activities. But let's take a second. Let's take a beat for a second. Let's talk about what that sort of the coalition of Hamas-loving, bridge blocking, commencement speech interrupting people, what they are, who they are, because I think it's important that we actually acknowledge who they are in a way that why it sends a signal to the rest of Americans about what that movement is and why they don't want to have anything to do with it. First of all, a lot of these people are basically Bernie Sanders voters. Let's just lay that right at the line. The Hamas coalition in America, the Hamas wedge, is essentially a Bernie Sanders, it's almost like a formula for a Bernie Sanders voter. Young, elite, college-educated, college-based, a lot of faculty, a lot of students, a lot of grad students. Adjacent to the labor movement, but not in the way that the labor union movement has traditionally been organized in the United States. It's very closely associated with large government spending programs and, a lot of giveaways. The fact that the Sanders coalition is deeply hostile to capitalism, to American free enterprise and free markets, the idea of American greatness, the idea that America should have friends in the world that America is obligated to support and should be proud of those things. These are all things that Bernie Sanders and his voters dislike meaningfully. And it's not surprising to me that they have all coalesced around Hamas and its war against Israel, against the Jewish state. Israel represents many of the things that Sanders voters hate about America. So this transference, what they see over there, affects how they think, how they're politically over here. Very interesting. It's a lot of cultural cues. And you've put your finger on it. The next piece of this is what their opposition to Israel says to the rest of America, right? And how they act and what that says to the rest of America. I think these are very volatile issues. And the fact that Biden is indulging the Hamas coalition, such as they are, is an indication, I think, of how badly he misreads their political importance. I think it's safe to say that if you're a Sanders voter in 2016 and then 2020, you voted for Biden in 2020. There was very little bleed between, from the Sanders voters out to Trump in 2020, very, very little. If they sat it out, they sat it out because they could afford to. They were in New York or California. It didn't matter. But in Michigan or in Pennsylvania, if you were a Sanders voter, you voted for Biden. You did. And I think in 2024, they probably will as well, despite all the Sturm und Drang. Meanwhile, however, you've got these salt of the earth, lower middle class or lower, sort of working class Americans, didn't go to college. Their kids don't go to college. They've been far more affected by the war in Iraq than the war in Gaza. They've been far more affected by the opioid epidemic than by anything that the Sanders crowd is concerned with, such as student debt. From their perspective, this country is off the rails. And then they see that these protesters, after the George Floyd verdict, and now especially now, that they're getting away with, essentially street riots. And they see America as basically spinning off its axle, and that Joe Biden is indulging it. Or more critically, he's he's not doing anything about it. He's not demonstrating any kind of leadership. He's not firmly saying this shall not stand.
Yeah.
And suffice to say, it's the signaling that's going on is it's classic virtue signaling, classic cultural signaling. He's not doing the kinds of things that would actually send a very definitive signal that he's not going to put up with it. I mean, a classic thing that he could do is he could summons, as the Congress did, he could summons university presidents to the White House for a closed door meeting. They could let them have it. He could let them have it. And he could say, look, you're permitting rampant bigotry, discrimination, and the glorification of the murder of Jews on your campuses without any concern for what this really says about the greatness of America's greatest institutions, which are our universities. Second, there are no standards here. What are your standards here? He talks about Title IX. He talks about DEI on campuses. He doesn't give a feather about the Jewish kids and the Jewish faculty on these campuses. It's outrageous, and everyone can see it. And if he did just that, if he just had a high profile sort of knuckle rapping, it might do a lot for him. But he doesn't have that in him. He just doesn't seem to care or understand that that's actually what the middle of the country wants.
Yeah, your answer explains, even if someone listening, watching doesn't agree with every single point, this is a reason why this could actually have an effect on the election. We've run this issue all the way from Gaza and that to presidential domestic policy in a way that really, it's a straight line. There's no one is going to deny these things are connected. So I would agree with you. I think that what Joe Biden is and isn't doing. Again, if I were advising him, I would basically do that. I would say, this is a way that you could potentially walk the tightrope. Crack down on what's going on in the universities without saying you're being too pro-Israel or not. That you could try to do it, but I don't think he has the people to help him do it or the skills to do it. It's a much easier lift for Donald Trump. I heard a phrase today. I was on the Mark Simone show in New York, and he called all these protesters anti-Semocrats.
Anti-Semocrats.
Yeah, I mean, the Trump campaign should use that term, because no matter who you think is in that rabble that's doing it, there's not one Republican and not one Trump voter in those protest groups. There's absolutely not. And that should be a term that they can use. It's a much easier lift for Donald Trump to say we should support Israel, and he'll say his usual thing about like, well, we don't want them to get away with too much. He walks sometimes a little bit of a tightrope on that. Obviously, he's incredibly supportive of Israel, but he does try to couch that sometimes. But he wouldn't have to couch anything about these protesters. He could just say these are rabble, they're anti-Semocrats,
they hate America. They hate America. I mean, it's actually. Look, I mean, you danced right on it. It's the reason why Biden can't do this. Listen, I think there are a lot of reasons. I think Joe Biden has a demonstrated record of not necessarily knowing what he really believes from moment to moment.
Right.
And he's tended to work the room and play the room. And he's a senator, fundamentally a senator at heart, which means he tells people what they want to hear for the time being. And that works in the Delaware, and it works in this, in the Senate. And, if you're a glad-hander, people's like, oh, that's just Joe. But now he's surrounded by people who actually are far to the left of where he used to be. I think that's I don't know where he is again, but he is surrounded by people who I think do not fundamentally believe in the greatness of America and the importance of American friendship and the alliances that America has built over the years. The fact that, Barack Obama, the person he worked, he was vice president to, signed a significant memorandum of understanding about arming Israel with, guarantees in one of the last years of Obama's White House. I mean, you'd think that he could lean on that and say, when I was vice president, we made an agreement, and this was the whole idea of making sure that Israel had the arms it needs is so that Israel knows that it can count on America. That's what we want. We want that. Israel wants that. This is great. And now he's throwing around arms embargoes essentially on Israel. And there's only one reason for that, is because either he doesn't remember what he supported once before, or his people are like, well, you need to actually tighten the screws. And there was recently, I guess there was a video of him speaking, extemporaneously to an anti-Israel person, journalist, I think, an influencer, at a White House event maybe last week. where he said, oh yeah, and he bragged about how tough he's been on Israel. So which is it, Joe Biden? Which one are you? Are you a friend or are you a foe? Because you can't have it both ways. And that is something else that Americans in the middle can sense. Look, I'm very pro-Israel, and I do not trust Joe Biden to be a friend of Israel. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What matters are people in Michigan and in Iowa and in Pennsylvania who want their president to be consistent and constant. And yes, they want also the president to support basic institutions, the smooth operating society, civil institutions, American alliances. And by the way, they've all their lives they've known Israel as an ally of the United States, and Israel is an ally of the United States, one of the best ones out there. And they're like, wait, why is the president getting squishy about Israel? I don't get it. They don't get it. And then obviously this is completely independent of the facts, okay, around October 7th, around the false accusations, the outrageous blood libels that have been leveled against Israel by the UN. Again, not a particularly pro-American institution, or not an institution that a lot of Americans really trust. And Joe Biden is bending over backwards to indulge this anti-Israel coalition, both international and domestic. And he's not paying attention to the voters who could actually reelect him. It's stunning. I mean, it may be one of the biggest examples of political malpractice that I've seen in the last 10 or 15 years. And we've seen a few.
Yeah, that's breaking the cardinal sin of the analyst. I mean, one of the things that has made me so sad over the last 4 years is, first of all, with all the mail-in ballots, and I'm not talking about fraud here, but I'm just talking about how we had a strange election in 2020. One of my favorite hobbies, which is studying election results from district to district, has been ruined. I just don't trust it, so I'm just not doing it. And I like learning from it, and I'm not learning anything from that. And the second thing is, if someone is doing something in order to get votes, however cynical you might think that is, I think that's interesting. That's interesting to discuss and interesting to hear. I think one of the biggest head fakes that America is going through right now, especially conservatives who are really falling for this head fake, which is that Biden's doing this for the votes in Michigan or the votes in Minnesota. I think a couple of times you said in your last answer, I think it's much more accurate what's going on. No, he has people in his administration who are supporters of Iran, who hate Israel, who are much further left than wherever he was at one point, who are pushing him to this, and they don't care about Michigan or Minnesota. And I wish they did. I mean, granted, it's still cynical. It's still cynical. But at least I know where they're coming from if they're doing it that way, and I can work with that. I can't work with people who are fundamentally not working on any moral plane at all. I'm sorry. People who say they're confused by this war, you're hopeless. It's hopeless. There's nothing to be confused about. This is a terrorist army, period. They need to be wiped out. That's it.
And the question here is something else. Is if you're sort of a Sanders Hamas voter, I mean, a Sanders Hamas voter, I think it should be a category. And you are looking at the 2024 election, and you're sensing, probably correctly, that Biden is on the lower end of the probability, right? He's less likely to win than Trump. We're still in that 50-50 zone. I'm not a prognosticator, but this much we know: the polls are there. And if you're if you're a Sanders Hamas voter, you want to be a spoiler. You want to spoil things. That is one of the things it's actually underneath all your political beliefs, is the idea of destruction, of destroying things that make America great, of even the general concept of bipartisanship. I mean, the Sanders Hamas voters hate bipartisans. They hate people like Amy Klobuchar or Joe Manchin. I mean, they couldn't stand Kristen Sinema. Why? Because these are senators who were certainly from the left, who sought and have continued to seek out ways to reach out to their friends on the right. That's what senators do. Sanders doesn't do that, and neither do the Sanders Hamas people. So if you're one of them, what do you want? What do you want, right? Do you want Joe Biden to win versus Donald Trump? Yeah, maybe. But you know what you also might want? You might want to be able to blame the moderates in the Democratic Party for the loss of the White House. That would actually be, in a sense, and we know this to be true, more valuable to him. That plus 4 more years of Donald Trump is more valuable to the Sanders-Hamas wing of the Democratic Party than winning the 2024 election. And I don't think that's even a cynical read. I think that's actually what they believe. That for them, as with, by the way, any movement that's highly partisan, highly extremist, they typically get more from losing than winning, because winning requires governing. And governing is hard, and governing requires compromise. And these people are not interested in compromise. They're interested in tearing everything down, as they say. That's literally what they say. So I actually, my view on things is that I'm not sure that the people inside the Biden White House want to lose. I think that's probably a huge stretch. I think they want to win. I think they probably do think that the key to winning is winning over not just, let's say the 50 to 100,000 Hamas Sanders voters in Michigan and Minnesota, which might be important. But actually, I think what matters to them is they want to generate enthusiasm in their base. And their base includes, by a huge number, academia, the academic institutions, the people associated with academic institutions. These are people who give money, like 99-1 to the Democratic Party. They generate all the ideas such as they are for the Democratic Party and the liberal movement. They are huge supporters of the progressive movement, and they're almost blindly supporting the Sanders-Hamas wing. I mean, quite frankly, I think they're playing the political game too. They know that their future rests very much with that particular coalition. They're not interested in the Clinton coalition. They don't really care about suburbia. They figure we'll change suburbia because we'll educate all their kids. So, as we know that's not the way it always works, but suffice to say, that's the game they're playing, and it's a long game. It's a very long game. And if Trump beats Biden in 2024, then they will have 4 years to basically take over the rest of the Democratic Party. And it probably won't be hard to do it, because who's going to restrain them? Yeah. Who's going to restrain them in the Democratic Party? It's hard to tell.
Folks, this is the kind of analysis you can only get on the Analysts. But I think we answered our own question for reasons that go well beyond the actual fighting on the ground and the politics in Israel, and even just discussing support for Israel or lack thereof. Yes, I really think that we could see much more of an impact from this war in Gaza because of all the other wheels that are turning, and Noam, hit a lot of them right there, and it really could make an effect. And to say that this has more of an effect on the voters than the war between Russia and Ukraine, I think goes without saying. It just does.
Absolutely.
So, Noam Neusner, thank you so much for joining us. Remember, he is a partner at 30 Point Strategies. Really an amazing guy. And I just think it's I'm really glad you were able to join us. By the way, joining us from Toronto, the Analyst went international, although we actually did have a guest from Israel on our first episode. So we went international again. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us this time when you're on the road.
Happy to do it, Jake. Always
all right.
See you now.
Thank you. And everyone, again, thank you so much for joining us for this latest edition of the Analysts, Grace Curley and Noam Neusner. I thank my guests. Please follow them on social media. And in the case of the Grace Curley Show, please check it out. She's on Rumble, or you can just go to WRKO in Boston. They have an international website, and you can see the show and follow the show anytime. Thank you for joining us. We'll have more issues. And again, I may have to be eating some humble pie next time if that first debate goes on between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Again, thanks for joining us. I'll speak to you next time.